Welcome everybody to the Firefighters Podcast. This week, I have someone who's not a firefighter, but someone who I've worked with on behalf of firefighters and the victims of 9/11, Miss Lila Nordstrom. Lila, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I wanted to have you on since I started the show because I think you're great at what you do, and I think your voice is something that needs to be heard. And I think there's a lot that gets lost when we talk about 9/11. So I'm hoping you can fill that in, especially for those in the first responder community, as we saw in the last couple of weeks when we lost all those children in those fires. It's kind of our responsibility to take care of the children, right? Like we take those losses the hardest.
Totally.
And I think that's kind of why we do what we do. Like my favorite part of being a fireman was the little kids waving at the fire truck when you drove. It's like the greatest feeling in the world. But really, we're there to help all people, but the helpless and the children are our main responsibility. And when it comes to 9/11, the children are not being taken care of, which is not what we do. So Lila's going to tell us what's going on and what we can do to help. So Lila, let's jump right in.
Absolutely. So there were probably about 50,000 students and young people who were in the exposure zone on and after 9/11. So it's a huge number of people who only make up maybe, like a sixth of the total population that was down there. There's obviously a lot of civilians that got impacted by 9/11. And I think even that is not something that a lot of people are aware of. I mean, I live in California, so I am aware of what the rest of the country says about the 9/11 health issue when they, haven't been exposed to New York media all of this time. And what they say is that, they have never heard about these people who lived and worked downtown. A lot of them, when I say that I work on this issue, their first question is, was your dad a first responder? They assume that there's no reason that like a young woman might be involved in this cause. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that we frame our responsibility to victims in general. I mean, I think people can understand why, we feel that we have a public responsibility to first responders because they are working on behalf of the public. So of course, we should absolutely be taking care of their health. We should absolutely be focusing on making sure that their jobs can be done safely. But, when it comes to community members, we often feel or speak like we don't really have a responsibility to members of a community who are also, affected by poor policy decisions and affected by, decisions that prioritize the health of the economy over the health of individual people. And that's problematic in a country that doesn't provide healthcare as a right. It's really problematic when you talk about sending children back to school because maybe it's safe, but you're not going to provide for their care in the long term. So if they do get sick, they're sort of on their own. And that's kind of what happened after 9/11. I mean, I was a high school student on 9/11. I was a student at a school that was 3 blocks from ground zero. We got sent back to school on October 9th, which is, the fires weren't even out on October 9th. October 9th was basically, the middle of the search and rescue operation still. Yeah. And they decided to reopen our school. The decision was really based on a need to stop the economy from freaking out. They were looking for acts of symbolism that would make it seem like New York was getting back on its feet, because what's more distressing to the economy as a whole than the idea that Wall Street is going to be closed for the foreseeable future? So they marched this, this special gifted and talented high school back in front of news cameras, back into our building 3 blocks from the World Trade Center, and then left us there in the middle of this huge environmental disaster for months, all the while denying that there would be any long-term health consequences. Now, of course, we know because of data that was collected on first responders that there were widespread health consequences to everyone who was in that community after 9/11. Our exposures in particular were very similar to a lot of the responders who came to help with the actual cleanup operation. We were there for 3 months of fires. We, had to walk through an area that was closed to the public to get in and out of our school building. On my first day back in school, we had to show our IDs to something like 5 police checkpoints, which maybe is not an indication that that's an area that's safe for minors and people without protective gear.
Right.
But so there was sort of, there was no responsibility taken for our health in the immediate aftermath. And it was a complicated time, and I think people were not necessarily thinking straight in general. But then when it became clear that that would have long-term health consequences, much like with first responders, it was like suddenly no one had any responsibility for anything. And we had an even harder time sort of proving our need and showing that we were showing that we needed the services, because no one had even collected any data on us. That was, I've learned a lot about the politics of research and medical data in doing this work. And, what's so interesting is the way that we determine need is based on the way that like research funding is, apportioned. And of course, the FDNY was keeping track of people's health. So of course, the FDNY was one of the first entities that could prove that there were health consequences coming out of 9/11. And of course, there were politics to that as well.
Right. But that's what leadership is. And to go back to what you said, that people weren't thinking clearly, but that's your job as a leader, as a mayor, as a governor, or whatever, is to think clearly when the shit hits the fan. That's what you get paid for.
It's wild to me how bad adults in charge of things are about seeing long-term consequences of literally any decision they make.
I feel like it's like George Costanza running out of the room screaming fire as he's pushing kids. Right. That seems like how our government responded after 9/11. They were just kind of, they freaked out. And then to make it look like they weren't freaking out, they made horrible decisions that are now costing thousands more lives needlessly. For all the reasons you just said, opening up Wall Street and all that pomp and circumstance that really it was all for a sort of symbolic victory that had nothing to do with what was happening on the ground. I mean, it was symbolism. No, and now on the back end, the money that they might have saved by opening up Wall Street a month or two earlier, how much is it costing them on the back end with this Healthcare and Compensation Act that we fought so hard for? Anyway, so let's stick with that. With the FDNY, we knew, I mean, not we, Dr. Kelly and Dr. Brazant knew what to do because we had gone through this already with the phone company fire in 1975.
Right. So and you're talking about occupational hazards being part, a career where occupational hazards are like a part of the job. So there's already a little bit of infrastructure for that kind of research.
And there's already a baseline because they make us do a yearly medical. So they already had our baseline medicals. So they essentially in October, probably when you were going back to school, they were sending us to Metro Tech to get another medical, which is where people like me found out that life's about to change. So the national program doesn't function anywhere near the way that the FDNY does. I mean, logistically, it is a lot harder, right? So what do you guys do to get in touch? Because it wasn't just your school, so people know. It was all the schools south of Canal Street. There's 19,000 kids believed to have been. Yeah,
there are two boundaries. The health program's boundary is Houston Street, and so I think that's where the 19,000 figure is from. And then below Canal Street, there's still thousands of school children who are attending school below Canal Street, and that's the VCF boundary. So we, in addition to just the complication of dealing with the survivor health program, have two incredibly complicated boundaries to try to explain to people, which is so typical of the federal government to have created that just additional burden. But basically, so there are two kind of wings of the health program in the Zadroga Act. And one is for first responders. And that program provides care at no cost for the covered conditions that the program, covers. And that care is provided as the government acts as a first payer for that care. So if you go to the doctor and you have, a lung condition and you're a first responder and you're in the responder program, whether or not you're in the New York program or the national program, your care is covered by the World Trade Center Health Program as a first payer. If you're a survivor, you not only have to meet the criteria of having one of those conditions, because unlike in the responder program, there's no proactive monitoring in the survivor program. So in the survivor program, you have to already be sick to get into the program. You have to kind of like self-identify as sick somehow. You get one free screening. And then after that, there's no more free screening. So if you're not sick, like good luck to you. But then in addition to that, the program acts as a second payer. So you have to have primary insurance, and then the program becomes a second payer on that primary insurance, which means that the administrative challenges of being in the survivor program are massive. But then there's also this issue of where the data that they use to link the conditions comes from. It comes from responder cohorts, which means it comes from cohorts that are large, that are almost 90% male, cohorts that were all adults at the time of the attacks. And because of that, conditions like developmental health conditions and women's health conditions are not covered by the program. There's no meaningful effort going on to collect data on a lot of those conditions. And so not only do we have these like additional barriers to getting into the program, and we have these administrative hurdles once we're in the program, but we also oftentimes see that the conditions that affect people in my cohort aren't covered in the first place. And there's like no meaningful attempt to gather the data that would ultimately lead them to be covered. And in the case of like reproductive health concerns, which is disproportionately a survivor concern because we're disproportionately female and also disproportionately young, right. We're going to miss the whole window of being able to treat those conditions, because by the time we have any data on them, no one's going to be of reproductive age anymore. So, I mean,
do you feel like that's their point, though?
Yes,
I feel like that's their tactic. Is
they're waiting us out.
I think they were waiting us out at every step, and they didn't expect more of us to keep coming down there to fight with them. I think.
Agreed. Well, and when you think about just like the burden it places on even responder victims of this to have to have spent 20 years, like, all of us lugging ourselves down to Washington all the time, with our health conditions in tow, and to essentially have to perform like political theater to get noticed. I mean, that's such an unfair burden to place on any part of the victims community for 9/11, let alone, people that we, imperiled via like poor government policy in the first place.
Yeah.
So
that's the challenge, right? I mean, I've read a lot of these articles about the women's health, and I mean, it's unfortunate that there weren't more female first responders, so we could have the government already gathering this information. So what do we do? How do we get it on the bill? How do people out there help us with this?
I think that there are a few things that we can do. One is that, and this is something that the survivor community has been applying pressure on the federal government for a long time about, but there needs to, I think, be more sort of public outcry about the fact that the research funding that goes to this issue almost exclusively goes to responder cohort studies. Right. We've for a long time been trying to put together like a sort of millennial cohort for even just the World Trade Center Health Registry, which is just a self-report study. They closed that study to new participants back in 2006, which means that a lot of young people were at college or out of town by the time that they found out that this was even a possibility. And so very few of us are in the World Trade Center Health Registry, which is the only cohort of survivor data essentially that exists. There's been attempts to put together cohorts. They've been scuttled every time. There are calls for research funding that NIOSH puts out that, they always claim because there's not meaningful cohorts of young people, they can't, they don't award money to those studies because they're not as rigorous as the studies on responders. But I think at a certain point, we have to recognize that disaster healthcare is not a science. It's kind of an art, it's not just a science. And sometimes you have to put together imperfect cohorts in order to get the kind of data you need to actually help people. I mean, I was on the Science and Technical Advisory Committee for the World Trade Center Health Program for a long time. And the thing that I found myself having to continually remind everyone, and that's, by the way, that's a body that meets publicly, that accepts public comments. So that's something that people can participate in. But I constantly had to remind people that this was not just, the World Trade Center Health Program is not just like a fun research study being done for the science, that it actually has to treat people. And that because of that, we can't always use really rigorous scientific, methods to decide what is and is not going to be covered, because, people's real lives are at stake in in this program. It's not just like we're doing it because it's fun to know the science. And, it's so frequently people seem to forget that about these kinds of programs. And I think we're going to see the same obstacles come up in the aftermath of COVID, where if and when there is some sort of federal response to the long COVID crisis, to the fact that this is going to imperil people, this is going to disable and imperil people in the long term, as a result of poor government policy in the same, in a very similar way. The next obstacle course is going to be people saying that we don't have enough data to prove linkages between X, Y, and Z conditions. And, in the aftermath of a disaster, you don't have the luxury of having perfect science. You should always prioritize helping people over perfect science. And I think that's not something that the health program has been really effective at doing, but it's something that with public pressure, they could be encouraged to do. And then I think the other thing is just that, we need to make sure the program gets refunded, that the funding for that program is in Build Back Better. I don't know what's going to happen to it, but it needs to happen.
I am so over them bringing it back up every few,
can we never just have a rest?
Well, that's what I've been saying. That's what I've been saying. And that's what I want to touch on, something that you just said, but I do want to put a pin in this, because this is something I've been wanting to talk to you specifically about. But when it comes to that disaster science, why aren't we just using basic science, which is a common denominator, which is what I've been saying about the bunker gear causing cancer. Well, if I work in New York City and I go to 100 fires a year, and there's a guy in the Midwest who doesn't go to any fires, but we both get the same cancer, and the common denominator is that we're wearing the same clothing. I mean, it's basic. Right.
Do we need like a 20-year study to prove that? Or can we just
we don't.
Presumptively cover it?
No, the problem is, Diane Cotter, I don't know if you listened to her episode, but she doesn't have the money that DuPont does. And as we know, money in Washington walks, which is what makes what we did even more amazing, is that we went into these offices without a checkbook and got them to listen. I mean, Mr. Stewart helped with that, but it's incredible that it even took him.
It's I think actually one of the reasons I think the public really seized on this story is because it was one of the few examples you get of like citizen activism really working. Yeah. So often you just hear that like big moneyed interests are just like out there ruining your lives, which they are. But this was like a great story about how all of the things that you are told, even though, the obstacles are greater for regular people, of course, and like, the pushback is greater. But this was like a story of regular people just like going to Washington and just persistently returning until they got what they wanted. And you so rarely get that as a public narrative. And I think because of that was sort of, it was sort of inspiring for people, because I think that for a long time, you're just taught this kind of activism doesn't work. And sometimes it doesn't, but also sometimes it does.
Well, I think people give up, and they make it very difficult to go to Washington and walk. 8 or 9 miles in a day.
You need the resources to do it. You need the health to do it. I mean, think about, like, I remember, when I first came down to Washington, the first group of responders I came down with, like almost none of them were healthy enough to return in 2019.
No.
I mean, it was a completely different group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And the very few people that remembered me from that, that first 2009 trip that I took with responders were people who had not been sick in 2009, but they were sick in 2019. It's a sort of alarming how long that went on, but also kind of wild that people just kept coming because people kept getting taken out of commission by their health issues, and still more people would come, which is, I think.
Well, that was my fuel for going, was that I didn't want anyone else to have to do it, especially you and your demographic. I mean, I'm technically not a millennial, but I'm not far off. I'm in that
just barely.
They call us like Zennials. We're like in the middle. But certainly, if you're going by the data we have, I'm at the bottom. I'm the closest that you're going to get to your demographic. I think the average first responder age was to and I was 21. So that's much closer to your demographic than I was to the one I was operating in. Just wanted to get that in there, even though I have some gray in the beard.
No, you're very useful. You're very useful.
I also have 2 daughters. So, but let's get back to what's grinding my gears. Is that they keep bringing this shit up. And this was something that struck me, and I'm not going to name names. I generally don't get political on the show, but I don't know if you remember this, to backtrack, if you've heard Jon Stewart's awesome speech before Congress from 2019, Lila also spoke at that hearing. So keep going back on the YouTube button and listen to Lila.
That's right.
She was also inspiring, not as funny, but also inspiring.
You can try, but 9/11, it's a tough one.
Yeah, he still
to do a
managed to get
comedy
some
routine.
zingers in there, though.
I know.
I don't know how he does it. That's why he's him.
Right.
But when we were in the conference room before that hearing, it was me, you, Mike, John, and a few other people.
Yeah.
But somebody from our side came in and said, our goal here is to get this pushed through in December. I don't know if you were listening, because you were kind of in the zone. Because I was trying to because everyone was in the zone. John was freaking Stewart was crying. I don't know if you remember, but he was crying.
Yeah, I know. And
everybody was nervous.
Everyone was acting weird.
Right.
John Field gave me a coin at one point that was a commemorative coin. And that's all I remember from that meeting, from that conference room, was getting this coin. I still don't know what it was. I don't remember anything about it.
I know. So I was trying to muster my best Newt Rockney, Ray Pfeiffer speech and try to get everybody going. But somebody walked in and said basically our goal here is to get this bill passed in December. And I remember me and Stuart looking at each other, and at the same time, we were like, why?
Right.
Why aren't we looking to get this bill passed tomorrow? Why are we waiting till December? And
this is in June. We're talking about June. This committee and this meeting is this hearing is happening in June. So.
And I don't have to tell you what was happening. The program. People were going crazy, and ever since then, I've just been thinking. And I look back on it, and I'm like, there are a lot of people who've benefited from this fight taking 20 years on all sides. I think, the fact that we kept getting 5-year bills benefited everyone, because midterm elections are coming up, and look what's the story.
Exactly.
The 9/11 health fund needs fucking money. So you don't, I don't know, man. I don't even know how to feel about it. I just feel like we got played again.
Well, I think that's kind of how, I think one thing I learned from being involved in this is that is how Washington operates. And it was helpful when I finally realized that, I stopped having expectations that were out of line with what, I started thinking, okay, how will this serve the people that are advocating for this bill on the Hill side? What do I need to tell them to make them able to tell a good story about this bill, which is, I think, a different mentality than I went in with, where I went in thinking this is just.
They beat you
and
down.
then I heard that, then I was overlooked at every turn because no one wanted to hear from the community. And then, I sort of, the only secret power I had in that effort, because a lot of community members got essentially disinvited from coming to the Hill because the imagery wasn't, what people wanted. It was literally just because I was, it was just because I was so young. And so, me walking in with a bunch of first responders is a very different image than just an adult from the community walking in with a bunch of first responders. I sort of realized that my theatrical presence was sort of more important than the content a lot of the time.
Yeah. I know.
It's all theater.
I know. I felt exactly the same way, which is before we started recording. What we were saying is kind of the sense of duty to do it because you get the microphones.
Exactly.
This is what we're the people that they want to hear from. And so unfortunately we have to keep talking about it. But for the record, a lot of times when I got asked to do interviews, I tried to push you first, but
I was going to say,
I always preferred you to speak over me.
One of the people that I feel like was the most gracious about making sure that the Survivor story got its airing when we were on the Hill together. I think I really appreciate everyone on the responder side who made sure that every time that they were in front of a microphone, that they pushed me or a community member in front of the microphone as well. Because, it's tough going because our story doesn't have the same American hero vibe to it. And so, I often call this wartime framing. Well,
I think it's even more so than I was doing my job. You people, everyone, the people who came from all over the country, that's the American story.
Right. Well, I never understood. I do understand. I understand in retrospect why we were why no one really knew what to do with our story. I think, there's this sort of tendency to want to frame any story about a huge crisis as being about heroes and villains. And so, you had the villains because you had the terrorists and you needed the heroes. And someone like me doesn't meet the sort of American imaginative definition of what a hero is, because heroes look like soldiers or look like the people that we grew up sort of, the politicians we grew up thinking were, fighting for the American people or whatever, they don't look like young women. And I think that's problematic for a lot of reasons, as you can imagine.
Right.
But
That's a different podcast.
Right. That's a totally different podcast. But because of that, it was really hard to convince media that like there was a narrative around this that actually was relevant to most Americans. Anyone can be the victim of a huge environmental crisis or an act of violence at any time. I mean, look at what, we have school shootings happening all over the place. Teenagers all over the country experience, acts of mass violence and become, forever victims of that kind of terror. People all over the country experience various kinds of environmental crises, whether that's a big factory next to you exploding or something like that, or just a tsunami coming for your home. I mean, everyone can relate to the fact that like you can lose everything, including your health, at a moment's notice. So the idea that we have no like fixed narrative in the media that can speak to that, and instead sort of like, have to kind of turn every story into a story of heroes and villains is so fascinating to me. But it was something I had to kind of learn to work with on the Hill, because that's what we do. That's how it is.
Right. And I think that's why we miss the point on what heroism is. I think
totally,
we because personally, I think people like you are the heroes, the people that,
oh, thank you.
no, because I might get in trouble for saying this, but people look at us like, let's just take our group for example. They look at the imagery. They don't look anything past that, or the uniform, or the the FDNY hat. They some meetings, that was all that they heard or saw. They didn't hear the words. They didn't hear the stories. They just, oh, there's a fireman in a wheelchair. All right.
Right, that looks pretty bad.
That looks right.
Right.
Like we don't dig deep enough to see who the true heroes are in not just our country but the world. I think.
Well, and I think to that end, I mean, one strategy I talk about a lot in my book, because it was so effective when I was on the Hill, was, and one of the reasons I really liked going down, with responders in particular, is because when we would go and have meetings on the Hill, no one would listen when I was talking in the meeting. Like the staffers were basically like on their phones, tuned out. And so what we would do is I would tell my story, and then like every responder in the room would basically like echo it, like repeat it.
Right.
Because that was how you got them to listen, is if it was coming from somebody with an FDNY hat, then suddenly they were like, oh, that's a sad story. Whereas if it was just coming from me, they would be like, well, we can't hear her voice for somehow is at a pitch we just can't hear. Like,
it's so frustrating. I don't know why you and I don't even think we ever took any meetings together, which
no,
I think is a crime, because that we
did appearances together.
Right.
I know we would have had good meetings together.
Right. I guess it was strategic, but to Lila's point, that's why it was done that way. They split us all up to make sure that Lila had first responders there with her too. Right.
You always, one of the most rewarding moments of my time in 2019 was because I knew this, I was always like, okay, I'm basically here to lobby responders. I'm not really here to lobby the politicians, because they don't listen to me, but I'm here to lobby as many first responders as possible to make sure that when they go into their meetings, they always mention the community, they mention students, they mention kids. And so in 2019, the very first meeting that I kind of crashed, because it was just in the hallway and I was just like looking for some people from Feel Good to like find, so I could find who I was going to go around with. I heard somebody telling my story to somebody else without knowing that I was there, because his back was to me as he was taking the meeting, and I was like, well, I've done it. This is everything I could have ever dreamed of. I needed to be there when I wasn't there, because I couldn't be everywhere. And that, in 2019, that finally started to happen, which was amazing.
That became one of our tactics. I did most of my meetings with Tom Wilson. We were like a little tag team, and that was his point. Like he would always ask them how old they were on 9/11, and then imagine that 9/11 happened and they had to go back and sit in a classroom in the middle. Like he would like build them up to it. And then
I've heard him give that spiel also when he didn't realize I was listening, and I'm always like,
well, you could be two buildings away and hear Tom.
Exactly.
The loudest man on the planet, but
right, exactly. Yeah, I've heard it down the hall as I was trying to find someone else's office. But yeah, that's always really rewarding, because I feel like that was, that was really the year that I felt like instead of just being the survivor who was coming along, that I, really felt like we were part of a community that was advocating for everyone together, which I think because the VCF, unlike the health program, treats responders and survivors the same way.
Right.
The policies are the same for survivors and responders. It's an easier program for us to approach as a full community. Whereas with the health program, they were always trying to kind of split us by being like, well, if we fund all these survivors, we won't have the money to help respond, which is not true, obviously. But, it was a divide and conquer strategy.
And I think back to 2015, I was in my congressman's office, and we were just hanging out, just me and him. Right. And he just kept saying things like, well, it's the most important thing is that we get the healthcare bill passed. And then and I said to him, I said, that's not really true. I mean, right. The healthcare part is great, but for me, I worked for New York City. I have a pension. I'm not going to go hungry. But for all these other people who are sick, who didn't work for a government agency and don't have a pension, and now they can't work, and what good is getting screened once a year going to do? How is that going to? Exactly. And they can't get life insurance and all the other issues that go along. And as you said, it's a secondary insurance. So
right, well, they don't even get screened once a year. They get screened once unless they're sick, and then they get screened once a year. But you don't even, if you're sick with uterine cancer, it's not covered, so you don't ever get screened again.
Right. But and then how do you get a primary health insurance if you have uterine cancer? So it's.
Well, and I really had to, I think I had to really understand health insurance law in a way that I have never wanted to in order to work on this issue, because so many of my initial concerns about my exposure were not even about my own illnesses, because, I've been asthmatic my whole life. And certainly my asthma got much worse after 9/11 and required treatment I couldn't afford and, required a bunch of stuff like that. But I also came to California where it was legal to reject people for pre-existing conditions from health insurance plans, and I couldn't buy health insurance. And I was like, there are so many sort of weird administrative obstacles that I'm having to navigate as a person who's not even that sick, that I can't imagine what my life is going to be if I have to live like this forever. And I think, there's sort of a little bit of blindness about what it is to be someone who doesn't have employer provided insurance, who doesn't work for the city, and how many members of the community that were affected are in a situation where not only are we, we don't have pensions, we don't, especially people my age, we don't have pensions, our jobs don't provide health insurance, but in addition to that, we don't have any stability or guarantees that we will continue to have the few resources that we do have, because we're just sort of out here in the open market, and the just general law is the only thing protecting us. And so we have sort of greater obstacles to overcome just to see doctors and find out we have 9/11 related conditions in the first place.
Yeah, I don't understand that. I experienced that a little bit. I remember I had thyroid nodules, right? Well, I still have them. Mm-hmm. And the doctor said to me, well, if they're cancerous, they'll be covered. I was like, okay, well, how do I go find out if they're cancerous?
Right.
She's like, well, we can't do that. That's not covered. You got to go to your own doctor. I'm like, this is the dumbest. Yeah. What are we doing? I don't understand. Right. So now I got to go to another doctor, have my insurance covered. And then then it's going to create the issue of, well, if it is cancer, now they're not going to pay for it anymore. So now what? So now
to have to constantly take financial risks just to diagnose yourself with the thing that's covered. What kind of system is that?
I think the best way to sum up our country, especially our healthcare system, it's like trying to cancel a gym membership.
Yes, that's a perfect analogy.
I think that's just what they just wear you down, and they just hope you give up and just keep sending them your money every month.
Well, and this is what I feel like the thing that I'm really sort of passionate right now about imparting to people is that because of COVID, this could be any of us. I think also a lot of people are wow, Lila went through a pretty bizarre, random experience that, had nothing to do with me because she was in New York on 9/11 and that's its own thing. But anyone can end up in the situation that the two of us ended up in by virtue of their own bad luck, or just by virtue of living in America at all right now. Right. Poor government policy is one of the reasons that both of us have had COVID. The sort of lack of control or the lack of precautions, the lack of funding going towards making sure that there was adequate capacity for testing. All of these things are public policy decisions that could affect both of our health in the long term and could crop up at any time with, significant, health difficulties that we didn't anticipate. And like, this is the situation now that like every single person in America is in. So like, I think it's important that people recognize that this story about, this sort of like group of 9/11, advocates who like went to Washington is not the only version of this story. Like this is currently directly relevant to every single person in America. And because of that, we should really think about whether we want to ask this much of victims. This is so much to have asked of us. I spent my whole adult life just like wandering Washington, telling people about 9/11. I mean, what a weird obligation to have been, to have had. And I felt that someone should do it. And I'm glad that I did it. I'm happy the two of us were there to do it. But I don't think that should have been our obligation in the aftermath of already experiencing something so traumatic. And I don't think the rest of America should have that obligation now. I wouldn't wish that on other people.
Well, so, I think that goes back to the leadership issues that we mentioned earlier. This pandemic, if it showed nothing, it showed that our leadership on all sides is fucking terrible. We have people dying. We have all this stuff happening around us, and our leaders are on Twitter arguing with each other, trying to get zingers in there. I remember Kristen and I were watching, the insurrection last year, like everyone else was, glued to the TV, angry, pissed off. And then these assholes come back and reconvene, and they're all up there working on their Type 5, cracking fucking jokes. Like, I know. Why don't you just tell us that it's all bullshit and you don't give a fuck? Because that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, this has been a sort of, just the entire COVID era, especially because there has been this has been the first time I think that I have seen like a need for clear action, in decisive action, for a sort of stretch of time where we're all dealing with the same emergency, and like it's like nowhere to be found. Like we can't be bothered for some reason to take any decisive action towards a goal, something that is truly affecting every level of society. I mean, it's
that's because the leaders can't agree on what the problem actually is, and they can't agree.
They're not agreed on the problem, so the solution is a secondary conversation they're not even ready to have.
Right, we're nowhere near the solution, and as well as I do that's not an accident.
That's well, I mean, and it's also we've rehashed a lot of the conversations that we had after 9/11 that were all about symbolism anyway. I mean, I have really taken issue with the way children have been used as sort of fodder for symbolic acts of either defiance or care or whatever. And, in COVID policy, where I'm seeing the same arguments rehashed over and over without any consideration for what we're actually asking of children and asking of teachers and asking of school environments, and what we're actually providing. Like I was told that I had to go back to school on October 9th because of my need for my routine, my need for things to return to normal. And it's like, it's not normal to go to school after 9/11, 3 blocks from the World Trade Center.
Right. In a classroom that was used as a morgue.
Classroom that was used as a morgue, exactly. In a school that's not been cleaned.
Right.
And in that same way, it might have been nice to have some kind of normalcy after that, but that just wasn't what was going to provide it. And we hear that conversation, being argued about children now needing to go back to school, but the schools aren't taking or given the budget to take proper safety precautions. And so all of it is just symbolism. It's all about whether we should defy COVID or, cower from it. And none of it has anything to do with what we're asking of the children and asking of the people that are caring for the children, which is a very frustrating thing to watch happen again after you've already been through it yourself.
Right. And especially when it's supposed to be our job is to.
Right.
And I don't get the arguments because you hear both sides like, well, we don't know the long lasting effects of the vaccine. So.
Right. But we do know the long lasting effects of COVID that we know they're bad.
But I mean, we don't really know that either. We don't know that these kids aren't going to, 2 of my kids have had COVID and at the very least, I don't want to see them that sick again, whether or not it's for the rest, it stays with them for the rest of their lives. Like,
absolutely.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think we're really bad at parsing the long-term consequences of a crisis. In general,
that's America. Right. That's why we're all in credit card debt. And
exactly.
because we don't think about tomorrow. It's like,
today, that's it. But yeah, I think that's maybe also an obligation that I feel, to talk about the sort of experience of what it is to actually be a kid in a crisis like this, as opposed, I know that parents have need for childcare, which is understandable. And also people who don't have children, I mean, like myself, maybe don't have perspective on what it is to have that need for childcare. But I think a lot of the time when we have conversations about how we're going to address the needs of children after a crisis, no one really thinks about what the experience of the kids is going to be in the aftermath of the crisis. Like people are not good at parsing the long-term consequences on the children themselves, which is something that at least I have experienced, the one thing I do have experience with, because that's what I've had to devote my adult life to. And it's frustrating to watch things break down the way that they have been.
It also exposes the inequalities in our country.
Absolutely.
We want to expect, okay, well, let's send our kids home for remote learning, but what about all the kids who don't have Wi-Fi?
Right.
Or live in government buildings where the Wi-Fi is controlled by the building itself, and how that's half the time they don't have heat, let alone
or rely on school for their lunch because that's where they're getting a nutritious meal. I don't know how nutritious these meals are these days, but
that brings me, and I think back to after 9/11, and the fire commissioner was telling the members to suck it up, because people were complaining about the air quality, whatever. However, his own son, who was a firefighter, he didn't allow him to go to ground zero and reassigned him to be his driver. Yeah. So, there you go. Like, so that's how the leadership in our country works. Speaking of which, have you seen Rudy Giuliani's $911 9/11 t-shirts that he's selling now?
Yes.
Maybe those proceeds can go to creating
gonna milk that America's mayor thing for as long as you possibly can.
And the people who eat this up and they don't realize is that there's tens of thousands of people like you who are going to live the rest of your life with the consequences of his decisions and his poor leadership.
Absolutely.
Everyone forgets that he was the most hated mayor in history on September 10th. Everyone hated him. Because
in writing my book, I had to kind of revisit the moments right before 9/11, and 9/11 itself was a primary day in the New York City mayoral race, and so the entire I had sort of revisited all the drama leading up to that week, because that was like the week where all hell broke loose, and he announced he was going to get divorced at a press conference and got kicked out of Gracie Mansion. All of that happened right before 9/11.
Right.
And so he was like a joke in New York City on September 10th. Basically, he was like the punchline of a joke. And then, I think the rest of America didn't know about the punchline part. And then they just met America's mayor on September 11th. And it was like, they didn't realize that New Yorkers had been over him for a while.
Right. And it's all because of the imagery and, just the photograph of him standing there in the dust. And, the fact that so many people bought into it, especially police and firefighters around the country, they did. What he did to us in his terms, we're still trying to make up for. He gave 7 years of 0% raises.
I mean, there was a time where I think NYPD at the starting NYPD salary, you could qualify for food stamps. You could qualify for public assistance as a New York City police officer, which is the most. It's an unconscionable breach of public trust to pay the sort of public safety forces so little that we have to provide public assistance to them so that they can eat. What kind
of and also what gets lost is the fact that he was wandering around with nowhere to go is because he decided to put the city's war room in the World Trade Center, which was the number one terrorist target for 2 decades. I mean,
well, when you have developer friends, you got to do what you got to do,
right? Because a park in Staten Island didn't make any sense, I guess. He
needed somewhere to hang out with his mistress. It was a convenient train stop.
I don't know how we turned into Giuliani bashing, but his t-shirts yesterday just set me off.
I know, me too. I was waiting to see if you would bring that up.
Well, how could I not?
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, read Lila's book.
Yes, some kids left behind.
Some kids left behind.
Available at the various online bookstore places,
If you
real
want to
bookstore
hear,
places.
if you want to hear more about this story, and I think maybe it's time we got a female Jon Stewart to come on and start pushing all the woman issues. Maybe Sam B's available.
That's right.
You know, it seems like something she'd be into.
We're putting a call out right now.
Yeah, Sam B, if you're
Who
listening.
is the female comedian that's going to come and talk about women's health and disaster health issues?
Right. We'll give
Call
you.
us. We're here.
We'll spring for cheap motel rooms in Washington.
Exactly.
You know. All right. Well, I'm glad we got to talk finally. I hope everyone out there listening understands that it wasn't just first responders that are being affected by 9/11 and dying from 9/11. You know, we get the press coverage, but there's 10 times more people out there like Lila dealing with these problems, and they need our help too. So pay attention. We're going to revisit this. Lila's going to keep us notified of when we need to break chops. But
right.
So what's the next step with the, I read the study on the reproductive rights, but what's the next step on getting that covered?
Yeah, so we're trying to get uterine cancer added to the list of covered conditions. There's very little data on uterine cancer in general. So not only is there not much data on its effect on 9/11 exposed populations, but no one actually knows what causes uterine cancer in the first place. And so we keep getting told that there's insufficient data.
Yeah.
It's the only major cancer that's not covered by the program. It's the only reproductive cancer that's not covered by the program. The idea that cervical cancer is somehow 9/11 related, but uterine cancer is not, blows. That's logically impossible. So we're trying to essentially demand that the program extend coverage to all reproductive health conditions, especially women's reproductive health conditions. And that is under consideration by the Science and Technical Advisory Committee, and there's a petition in to the administrator, but we're trying to make sure that there's as much public discussion about it as possible so that there's public pressure when they do make that decision. It's been rejected something like 6 times. So it's a never ending parade of rejections over here on the women's health front, but we're hoping this time is different.
This is anecdotal, but Cialis is covered by the program. So,
well, sure. I mean, that makes perfect sense. That doesn't shock me even one bit, which is a sad state to report that I'm in. But
I think that's another symbolic American.
That's right. Cause
right there. So. All right. Well, Lila's awesome. Follow her on the socials. What are you at, Lila Nordstrom?
I'm at Lila in Chelsea.
At Lila in Chelsea. You have your nerd podcast.
I have my elections podcast. If you're a political wonk and you want to hear about elections, we're at Brain Trust Live.
Check that out. And remember that the Firefighters podcast. We talk about everyone, right? We care about everyone. It's the job of firefighters to take care of kids like Lila, even though we're almost the same age.
Right.
But that's what we do. And we want to give voices to everyone. So we're going to revisit this. And there is a connection between what Lila was saying and what Diane was saying about the chemicals, the PFAS chemicals in our bunker gear, because it's not just in our gear. Yeah. And all of America is going to deal with this. Like we see in Flint, Michigan. There are environmental issues. This shit is in our water. It's in our clothes. So you can't escape it. So you have to give a shit about this because it affects all of us. And that's our point.
Absolutely.
So Lila and I will be back in Washington at some point.
Of course. They always call us back.
Right. Because apparently they're going to need more money or something. So, but till then, thank you for coming on. Try not to get COVID again.
God, I know.
And
thank you for having me, though. I really appreciate this. And I always appreciate your advocacy for survivors.
Of course, man. That's what we do. So we're all on the same team.
That's right.
All right, Lila. Thank you very much. And be well.
You too.
All right.